framework to talk about all of this from my point of view is consciousness and its contents, right? So we have consciousness, the fact that there's something that is like to be us, right? The fact that the world and our internal experience is illuminated, that it has a qualitative character. And then there's the question of what is that qualitative character? What is it? What kinds of information do we have access to? What does it feel like to be us? How do different states of arousal change that? So you talked about fear. Yeah, fear can change a lot of things, but and various neurological deficits, or you can add drugs to the mix. You add psychedelics that radically transform the contents of consciousness. From my point of view, consciousness itself is simply the cognizance, the awareness that is the floodlights by which any of that stuff appears, right? So consciousness doesn't change, but its contents change. And to come back to meditation for a second, many people think meditation is about changing the contents of consciousness. There's some contents you want to get rid of, like anxiety. Other contents you want to encourage, like calm and or unconditional love, or some other classically pleasant pro-social emotion. And that's all fine. That's all possible. But the real wisdom of the 2,000-year-old wisdom of meditation, it really is the chewy center of the Tootsie Pop, is a recognition of what consciousness itself is always already like, regardless of the contents and the changes in contents. And this is why, and we might talk about this, but this is why they're mutually compatible. Psychedelics and meditation for me are somewhat orthogonal, because psychedelics is all about making wholesale changes to the contents of consciousness. And there's some wonderful consequences of doing that. There can be some harrowing and terrifying consequences of doing that, but generally speaking, I think used wisely, they can be incredibly valuable, and therapeutic potential there is enormous. But the crucial disjunction here is that there really is something to recognize about ordinary waking consciousness, that consciousness that's compatible with my driving a car to get here on time, right? You don't have to have the pyrotechnics of being on LSD to see to transcend the central illusion that I'm saying is the thing to be transcended, which is the sense that there is a duality between subject and object in every moment of experience. And to take it back to something you said about just all of our different modes in ordinary life, the interesting thing is I think people are constantly losing their sense of self, and they're not aware of it. And there's probably an analogy to the visual system here, which is to visual saccades, which perhaps you've spoken about at some point on your podcast.
Not enough, so please.
Yeah. So what happens with our, every time we move our eyes, this is called a saccade, and we do that about 3 times a second or so, just normally. There is the region of motor cortex that affects that movement sends what's called an efferent copy of that motor movement, which is used as information that propagates back to the visual cortex. It suppresses the data of vision while the eyes are moving, because otherwise, if you weren't doing that, every time you moved your eyes, it would seem like the visual scene itself was lurching around. And people can experience this for themselves if they just, touch one of their eyeballs on the side, not all that hard, and kind of jiggle it, and then you can roll it around, you can jiggle it from side to side. You can see that a movement of the eyeball that's not governed by your ocular motor system delivers a jiggling of the world, because it's not, your brain is not anticipating it in the same way, and you're not producing that same predictive copy of the movement.
It's a little bit like some action sports filmmakers on our staff here, the gimbal, that holds an iPhone, like you see the kids on surfboards or skateboards or something. They hold a phone while moving around, or the people who, like the vloggers, does anyone even still use that? Moving around, and it's image stabilization, essentially, that keeps the camera steady. And these are more than cameras, of course, for those listening, pointing at my eyes, but they do far more than just what a camera would do. But yeah, this internal system of image stabilization. Yeah, I could see perhaps where you're going with this. That it allows us to remain in a self-referencing scheme as opposed to sort of paying attention to just how confusing it is to track the visual world at some level.
Well, actually, where I'm going is that so people are having this suppression of vision 3 times a second on average, and they're not experiencing it, right? So you're literally you're effectively going blind, and you're not noticing it, and
this is very fast.
yes, it's very fast. Now, there's an analogous suppression, I would say, of the sense of self that occurs every time attention gets absorbed significantly in its object, right? So like we even have this concept of losing yourself in your work, or you losing your. I mean, the classic flow experiences have this quality where there's, and this tends to be why they're so rewarding, where there's just if you're in some athletic activity or an aesthetic one. Or you could be having sex, or you could be whatever it is, some peak experience. Its peakness usually entails there being some brief period where there was no distance between you and the experience, right? For that moment, you were no longer looking over your own shoulder or anticipating the next moment or trying to get somewhere where you weren't, or micromanaging errors, or there's just the flow of unity with whatever the experience is. A surfer on the wave, right? And we love those experiences, and then we are continually abstracted away from them by our thinking about them. Or we'll think, oh my God, that was so good, or how do I get back to that? Or you're looking at a sunset, it's the most beautiful sunset you've ever seen, and then you're continually interrupting the experience of merely seeing it with a commentary about how amazing this is, and I wonder, what are real estate prices here? I mean, is it possible that to move here? And your mind is just continually narrating a conversation you're having with yourself, however paradoxically. I mean, you're telling yourself things that you already know, as though there were two of you, rather often, right? You're just. I'm looking for, which is the water, and it's, oh, there it is, right? But I'm the one seeing it. Who am I saying, oh, there it is too? As though there's someone else who needs to be informed about the thing I already saw, right? So it's there's something about our internal dialogue that is paradoxical.
Is there any neurologic condition, selectomy or anything like that, where somehow people feel more unified with the self on a continual basis? The observer and the actor.
Yeah.
Whether it stayed more as a complete sentence. Is there any known neurological syndrome? It makes it sound like a bad thing, but it could be a good thing, whereby people feel that the actor and the observer within them are unified continually.
There's not a pathological one. Some of the work on the default mode network suggests that that's at least part of the story. Right? So the default mode network, which has been talked about a lot of late because it's come up both in the meditation literature and in the psychedelic literature. But its original discovery was that, and the reason why it was called the default mode was that in virtually every neuroimaging experiment ever run, they found that between tasks, when the brain was just in its default state, these midline structures would increase their activity, and then they would reliably diminish whenever the person in the scanner was on task, and usually that meant some kind of outward-looking, visual discrimination task. I mean, but it could be visual, it could be semantic, it could be, but it tends to be their eyes are open and they're paying attention to something that's being broadcast to them through monitor goggles, or they're looking at a mirror that's showing them a computer monitor. But the general insight was there are these midline structures in the brain that seem to be increasing their activity when the brain is just kind of idling between tasks, waiting for something to happen. And then further experiments found tasks that actually upregulated activity there beyond baseline. And those tasks seem to be self-referential. so that when you ask people, you give them a list of words and you say, well, do these any of these apply to you, right? And people or you ask people to think about. Actually, one experiment I did when you're challenging people's beliefs, when you're challenging beliefs that have more of a personal significance, like political or religious beliefs, you get an upregulation in these regions as opposed to just generic beliefs about, you're in Los Angeles, this is a table, there's something that people are not holding fast as a matter of identity. So anyway, both meditation and psychedelics seem to suppress activity in these regions, which we know are associated with both self-talk, mind wandering, and explicit acts of self-representation. Right. So,
could we say that they are somewhat autobiographical because they access memory systems, and the way you're describing them, and in the way that a colleague of mine who's been a guest on this podcast, I don't know if you interact with him before, but I do very much enjoy whatever interaction you would have is David Spiegel. He's our associate chair of psychiatry. So he and his father then he founded hypnosis as a valid clinical practice in psychiatry. And hypnosis, which is obviously a heightened sense of attention with deep relaxation, is known to dramatically suppress the default mode network. He talks about this a lot, and I always wonder as we take down activity within the default mode network, what surfaces it in its place, and is what surfaces in its place, does that somehow reflect that the two are normally in a push-pull? Because that's not necessarily the case, right? When I fall asleep, I can hallucinate, but that doesn't mean that during the day, the fact that I'm looking at objects is what's preventing me from hallucinating. If I close my eyes, I can get imagery, but there's this kind of a different illusion, the illusion of antagonistic circuitry sometimes. I don't want to take us off course, but the default mode network seems to want to be there. It seems to be fighting for our attention, unless we give ourselves a visual target or an auditory target or some salient experience of some kind, it sounds like. And then I'm surprised to hear that meditation reduces activity in the default mode network at some level, because meditation to me oftentimes involves paying attention to some sort of perceptual target.
Right. Yeah.
Maybe you could eventually explain as to how it might do that or why it might.
Yeah, and I don't think it's the whole story, because obviously outward going attention is not, even if you're having the kind of egoic saccade that I'm talking about, where you're actually not clearly aware of yourself, you're not clearly defining yourself as separate from experience for the moment of paying attention, so you are sort of losing yourself in your work. That's not the same thing as having the clear meditative insight of selflessness that I'm claiming is the goal of meditation. But there is to wind back to the original point I was making, and the reason why I drew the analogy to visual saccades, I do think there's a continuous interruption in our sense of self that goes unrecognized. And but the conscious acquisition of the understanding that the self is an illusion is a different experience, and you're then focusing on this absence. Actually, there's another analogy to the visual system that applies here, which is to the optic blind spot. I mean, it's like so. Which is a good analogy for me, because it cuts through a bunch of false assumptions as to where that you would look for this or how this relates to ordinary experience. So as many people know that we have, in both eyes, we have what's called the blind spot, which is a consequence of the optic nerve transiting through the retina. Unlike cephalopods, I think cephalopods have their optic nerve, as an omniscient being would have engineered it, connecting the retina from the back, and therefore there is no area of blindness associated with its transit back through the retina. But
ours photoreceptors on the outside.
Exactly.
Humans, for whatever reason, put photoreceptors. Well, yes. I always say I wasn't until the design phase. Something put photoreceptors. Combination of things put photoreceptors in the back, and so you actually have to send the highway of information through the pixel center of the eye. Yeah, cephalopods and Drosophila. Basically, invertebrates.
Right.
The design is more at its face logical. Mammals, very illogical design, at least as far as our judgments go.
Yeah. But it gives me a good analogy, so I'll take it.
I'd like to take a brief break and acknowledge our sponsor, Athletic Greens. Athletic Greens is an all-in-one vitamin mineral probiotic drink that also contains digestive enzymes and adaptogens. I started taking Athletic Greens way back in 2012, so that's 10 years now of taking Athletic Greens every single day. So I'm delighted that they're sponsoring this podcast. The reason I started taking Athletic Greens and the reason I still take Athletic Greens is that it covers all of my foundational nutritional needs. So whether or not I'm eating well or enough or not, I'm sure that I'm covering all of my needs for vitamins, minerals, probiotics, adaptogens to combat stress, and the digestive enzymes really help my digestion. I just feel much better when I'm drinking Athletic Greens. If you'd like to try Athletic Greens, you can go to athleticgreens.com/Huberman, and for the month of January, they have a special offer where they'll give you 10 free travel packs plus a year's supply of vitamin D3, K2. Vitamin D3 and K2 are vital for immune function, metabolic function, hormone health, but also calcium regulation and heart health. Again, that's athleticgreens.com/Huberman to claim their special offer in the month of January of 10 free travel packs plus a year's supply of vitamin D3, K2.
So in any case, we have this blind spot, which I think most people learn this in school, although my daughters had not been taught this in school. I just showed them this for the first time like a month ago, and they were briefly fascinated, and they want to return to their screen time. Anyway, you can take a piece of paper and you make 2 marks on it, and then you cover one eye and you fixate on one mark. And you can look this up online if you need details about how to do this. And while staring at one fixation point, you move the paper back and forth, and you can get it to a place where the other mark disappears. And you can run this experiment long enough to satisfy yourself that there is in fact a blind spot in your visual field, which you with one eye closed, you don't normally notice. The reason why you have to cover one eye is because each eye compensates for the blind spot of the other. So, which is to say that if you close one eye and survey the visual scene, something really is missing, whatever you're looking at. If you're looking at a crowd of people, somebody is missing a head, and you're not noticing it. And it's not easy to notice because the brain doesn't tend to vividly represent the absence of information. I mean, it's just part of the game that's not being rendered. It's not showing up as a break in the visual field. It's just not there, and people have argued that there's a kind of filling in phenomenon that happens, but I think that can be misunderstood or exaggerated.
But the eye movements themselves that you described before, I guess I should say that the saccade analogy about transiently and repetitively erasing the self works perfectly here, because indeed microsaccades, the smaller saccades that occur all the time, also prevent our eyes from fixating in one location for long enough to observe our blind spot, even if one eye is closed.
Right.
So if we the experiment's done with paralytics to essentially lock eyes in one location, basically things just start disappearing.
Yeah, it just fades
away. We'd all love to think that we'd start hallucinating, but actually we start going blind.
Right.
And those experiments have been done, and on humans, I hear they're quite terrifying.
Yeah. But, I mean, you can do that for yourself too. It just it begins to just all melt away in a warm glow. No psychedelics required. But the interesting point there is that when you ask yourself, okay, so as a consequence of the eye's anatomy, there's this thing you can see that is absent from your experience. But the question is, where is that in relationship to the rest of you, to your mind? Is that deep within, or is that in some sense right on the surface of experience? And there's this expectation that people have, again, I think conflating meditation with a search for changes in the contents of consciousness. They're looking for much more subtle things to notice about the mind, or much vaster things to notice. Psychedelics sets up this expectation that you do a massive dose of mushrooms or LSD and everything changes. I mean, you just get this full beatific vision, and you get not only visual changes but emotional changes, and you get synesthesia, where you have much more mind in so many ways. So they begin, having these experiences or reading the mystical literature, you begin to think, okay, well then freedom is really elsewhere, or it's deep within. It's like it's not coincident with the ordinary awareness that can see this coffee cup clearly, and that can just transition attention to, reading an email, with the sort of full sobriety of just ordinary waking consciousness. But the truth is, this insight into selflessness, this insight into the non-duality of subject and object, is as close to ordinary consciousness as this insight into the optic blind spot. Like, where do you have to go to have this insight into the blind spot? No, you just have to go anywhere. You just have to set up the experiment correctly, such that you can see the data, but the data is right on the surface. It's like it's almost too close to you to notice. I mean, if it's at all hard to notice, it's because it's so close, rather than it's deep within or far away. And there are other analogies, like I don't know, remember those mind's eye pieces of artwork that were the random dot stereograms, where you have an image that pops out. I always find it very difficult to see those because I have very dominant eye, but some people
can't see those. These are these images that you see at the kind of like touristy shops, and people say, "Oh, there it is, the whale," and I'm thinking, I don't see it. Kids that swim a lot when they're younger, and they tend to breathe just to one side. I don't know if this was you. This was definitely me.
Yeah.
They tend to will keep one eye closed. You set up a pretty strong ocular dominance. Biasing your vision to one or the other eye early in life, whether or not you're learning how to be a bow hunter, or you're learning how to throw darts or shoot billiards, or anything involves selectively viewing the world through one eye for even a couple of hours, can set up a permanent asymmetry in the weighting of visual flow, flow of visual information from the eye to the brain. It's reversible, but only through the reverse gymnastics of covering up the other eye intentionally. So I had to be reverse patched for a while because I was seeing double because I lost binocular vision. I don't stand a chance in hell of seeing an image pop out of a random dot stereogram, which is kind of ironic because I did my PhD on binocular circuitry. But nonetheless, if people can see these, or if they can't, I think they provide a really terrific example of what you're talking about as a larger theme, which is that perceptually you see a bunch of dots, and then all of a sudden, what you thought wasn't there is suddenly there, but can just disappear again. Or there are certain visual illusions, if we were to include others, that once you see them, you cannot unsee. So there's the faces, vases, figure ground type stuff. Very bistable percepts. Bistable percepts. And then there's sort of ocular competition. You show two different images to the eyes, each of the two eyes. It is near impossible for people to perceive them both simultaneously. So it's a little bit of what you're describing. I mean, these seem to be fundamental features about the way that neural circuits are organized, that they don't want to stay fixated on any one thing for very long. To do so either takes training, intense interest, intense fear, intense excitement. When I say intense, I guess I come back to this idea that the autonomic nervous system is somehow governing our ability to spotlight at any one location for very long. Is that a useful framework, or is that going to take us down a different path?
Well, it's sort of a different path for this. I mean, the only point I was making is that the seemingly paradoxical claim that something can be right on the surface and yet hard to see, right? So like there are things that are because it's, and again, this seems to justify the expectation held by I think the vast majority of people who get interested in these spiritual things, for lack of a better word, that the truth must somehow be deep within, right? Like there's really there's some distance between between the one who is looking and the thing that has to be found, right? And you have to go through this long evolution of changes. I mean, there's many metaphors that set this up. It's like you're at the base of a mountain and you have to climb to the top, and so you have to find the path, however circuitous, to get you there. But there really is a distance between between your starting point and the goal. And what I'm arguing, and this is a kind of a non-dual, to use the term of jargon, this is a non-dual approach to meditation as opposed to a dualistic one. That there really is the path and the goal are are coincident, right? That that you have to unravel the logic by which you would seek something that's outside of the present moment's experience, i.e., really not available to you now, because so many things worth having, so many skills worth acquiring, really are not available to you now. It's like if you want to be a pianist, or if you want to speak Chinese, or if you want there's something you don't know, and then you want to learn that thing, and there's a whole process, right? And you might not be capable of doing it, right? And real mastery is far away, right? If you've never hit a golf ball, and you want to hit a golf ball 300 yards straight, right? I can pretty much guarantee you're not going to do that initially, and you're not going to do it, on day 2, and you're not going to do it reliably for the longest time. And there's real training, in front of you to be able to do that reliably. An insight into, and really the core insight, the insight that is the core of the Buddha's teaching, to take one historical example of this, really is available now, and it is not. Granted, it can be very hard won for people. I had probably spent a year on silent retreat in 1 week to 3 month increments before I sort of got the point I'm making now, right? So literally, and these are retreats where you spend 12 to 18 hours a day just meditating, trying to unpack the kinds of claims I'm making now. So it's possible to rigorously overlook this. It's possible to stand in front of the mind's eye image and stare in a way that is guaranteed not to give you pop out, right? To be adept at even staring in that way. So it's possible to be misled. And so what I'm trying to argue here is that there's a fair amount of leverage you can get with better information, which can kind of cut the time course of your searching for this thing and kind of cancel your false expectations about just where this is in relation to your ordinary waking consciousness. And it's possible to get bad information and to have a bunch of experiences. You go and do an ayahuasca trip, and it's incredibly valuable, and it's valuable for all the ways in which it changed the contents of your consciousness in startling ways. And you had insights into your past and into your relationships and into why you're not as loving as you might be, and there's lots to think about, and you're like, okay, that's all great, that's all something that we can talk about, but it truly is orthogonal. If it makes a point of contact to what I'm talking about, it's really just at one point, and it's at the point where this sense of subject-object division in consciousness is illusory and vulnerable to investigation. And if you investigate it at sort of the right plane of focus, you pick the analogy you want from, whether it's setting up the optic blind spot experiment in just the right way so that you can see that it's actually not, the data is not there, or the bistable percept is great because when you see one of these images, like the vase face diagram, or the Dalmatian, that looks like just a mess of dots, and then you see the image of a Dalmatian dog pop out. Once you see it, you really can't unsee it. Once you have the requisite conceptual, anchor to it, then every time you look, you're going to find it again, and it eventually becomes effortless. And that's what ultimately meditation is. This kind of meditation. You ultimately learn to recognize that there's no separation between you and your experience, right? There's not the experience on the one hand and the self on the other. There's just experience, right? There's just seeing, hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, thinking, feeling, proprioception, add whatever channels of information you want to that, but there's just the totality of the energy of consciousness and its contents, and it's not that you're on the riverbank, and this is how it can seem in the beginning, even when you're practicing meditation fairly diligently. It can seem like you're on the riverbank watching the contents of consciousness flow by, and meditation is the act of doing that more and more dispassionately. So you're no longer grabbing at the pleasant or pushing the unpleasant away. You're just kind of relaxing and in the most non-judgmental frame of mind, just witnessing the flow, right? But if you're doing that dualistically, you feel like the meditator. You feel like the subject aiming attention. And so now you're on the riverbank watching everything go past. But the truth is, you are the river, right? Experience itself there is just experience itself. You're not on the edge of experience. And everything you can notice is part of the flow, right? And there's no point from which to abstract yourself away from the flow, to stand outside it and to say, okay, this is my life, this is my experience, this is my body. Yes, you can do that. I mean, those are all just thoughts, but that's more of the flow, right? And so there's a process by which you would eventually recognize that there's no distance between you and your experience. And again, you can wait for those moments in life where experience gets so good or so terrifying, or it's just so salient, right? Your amygdala is driving so hard. I mean, so you're in a war and you can't think about anything because the enemy's shooting at you, and this is the most thrilling video game you've ever played in your life, and your life is on the line. Or you're at the peak of some athletic event where there's just, you don't know how you're doing the things you're doing, but it's all happening automatically, right? But those are 1/100th of 1% of one's life, and what I'm calling meditation is a way of simply understanding the mechanics of attention, whereby you are denying yourself that unity of experience so much of the time, and recognizing that that's it's based on a misperception of the way consciousness always already is.
Well, if there wasn't an incentive to learn how to meditate properly, that was one. And I've been meditating a fair amount since I was in my teens, but more along the lines of just paying attention to breath and recognize thoughts, sort of open observer type meditation,
right,
or focused attention. I would suppose more of the focused attention type. We'll get into these a little bit later, but I have a number of questions related to what you just said.
Sure.
I love the idea that this thing that we would all do well to understand, to observe consciousness itself as opposed to trying to alter the contents of consciousness, may sit much closer to us than one might think. That it, and that because it sits so close to us, that might be one of the reasons why we miss it.
Yeah.
I go right to a visual system example. I mean, if you're wearing corrective lenses and there's a speck on your lens, typically you're looking out through the lens, and so you wouldn't observe that speck. Any number of different analogies could work here. The fact that there are states, however few, positive and negative, ecstasy, extreme ecstasy and extreme fear being the two, I think, most obvious ones that seems like we agree on, that allow us to capture this sense of completeness of self, or the unity of the observer and the actor. The fact that those are seldom for the non-trained, for the non-meditator, suggests to me two things. I think one perhaps worth exploring more than the other, but one is that what's really being revealed in the states where we can feel the unity of the observer and the actor is understanding something fundamental about the algorithm, not the online algorithm, but the algorithm that is our nervous system. Just as you mentioned cephalopods, mantis shrimp see an enormous array of color hues that we don't, right? Their maps and representations of the world are fundamentally different. Pit vipers see in the infrared.
Right.
We're restricted to somewhat of a limited range within the color spectrum, but still more vast than that of dogs or cats. Okay, so understanding that, for seeing what a pit viper can see for moments would be informative, perhaps. Sensing heat emissions as a human might be invasive, and maybe that's why we don't do it. So the question is, to just make it straightforward, is why would the system be designed this way? Again, neither of us were consulted the design phase, but that brings me to perhaps the more tractable question, which is about development. I'm a great believer that the neural circuits that encouraged healthy parent-child relations or unhealthy parent-child relations, as the case may be, in childhood stem from the initial demands of internal versus external states, which is exactly what we're talking about, which is that a young child feels anxious because it needs its diaper changed. It doesn't really know it needs its diaper changed, or it's cold, or it's uncomfortable, or it's hungry, or it's overly full. And so it vocalizes, and then some external source comes to us and relieves that, hopefully, right? And so the fundamental rule that we first learn is not that we have a self or that things fall down, not up, but is that when uncomfortable, externalize that discomfort, and it will be relieved by an outside player. And then, of course, there's a repurposing of that circuitry for adult romantic attachments. I don't think anyone doubts that, and that can explain a lot, indeed, about attachment and so forth. So something about our developmental wiring and the algorithms that these neural circuits run tend to bias most people, the non-practice meditators, to live a somewhat functional life, at least, without this awareness of actor and observer.
Right.
And so what you're really talking about is a deliberate intervention to understand and resolve that gap in the algorithm. Do I have that right?
Yeah.
I'm more or less restating what you said in a way that I'm hoping will serve as a jumping off point as to, why questions are always very dangerous in biology or any,
Or in relationship. Yeah.
What's that?
Or in relationship.
Or in relationship, right, exactly. Although I think it all does really go back to this early developmental wiring, which of course is modifiable. That's the beauty of the nervous system, is it's the one organ that seems to be able to change itself, at least to some degree.
Right.
So what are your thoughts about the organization of the circuitry to essentially